Carlos es investigador Ramón y Cajal en el Departamento de Historia Medieval, Moderna y Contemporánea de la Universidad de Salamanca. Está especializado en arqueología de las sociedades rurales en la larga duración, muy larga duración. Eso me suena. Su último proyecto, financiado por una beca individual Marie Curie, se centra en la arqueología de la industrialización del noroeste rural ibérico desde el siglo XVIII hasta nuestros días. Su último libro, Arqueología y cine, la arqueología en la gran pantalla, es un análisis de la construcción social de la arqueología en el cine. Y recientemente también ha recibido un proyecto del Ministerio de Parques Nacionales, lo que también le abre otra vez otra línea de trabajo muy interesante. Y sin más, te doy paso.
Vale, pues muchísimas gracias y gracias a la organización que también me ha permitido estar aquí porque luego mañana tengo clase, entonces tengo que ir de un lado para otro.
Os tiene traumatizados.
¿Eh?
Os tiene traumatizados.
Ni me doy cuenta porque tengo que estar en tantas cosas que no me para a pensarlo. Pero que, bueno, que en cualquier caso, muchísimas gracias por adaptarse un poco a los horarios. Preparé la ponencia en inglés, entonces creo que es, por respeto a mí mismo, hacerla en inglés. Entonces, bueno, espero que os enteréis de algo. Este es el objetivo. So, I would like to start with a contemporary example that is the Repubblica Partigiana di Montefiorino. This is one of the different political experiences that in the midst of World War II emerged as independent territories, controlled in this case by the partisans. So one of them was this Repubblica Partigiana di Montefiorino in the province of Reggio Emilia, autoproclaimed independent between June 17th and August the 1st, 1944. And during this month and a half, partisans were able to control the territory, restructuring the administration around what they called the Giunte Popolari, which managed the public sphere in this territory. At the same time, the Repubblica fully participated of the social and economic basis of northern Italy, based in this case on agriculture, with an increasing level of industrialization by this time. And in spite of this short period of existence, this republic had a clear and distinctive material impact in, for example, the creation of a partisan hospital or the systematic reparation of public infrastructure. Since 2022, we have been conducting archaeological works in this territory regarding the archaeology of the partisan resistenza. And one interesting conclusion is that there is a distinctive materiality of the partisans in the reuse and recycling of materials coming from in this case, the military, into the everyday life of the people. For example, we have been documenting extensively the reuse of parachutes as clothes for the peasant people in these territories. So this experience of the Repubblica Partigiana di Montefiorino synthesizes, I think, some of the ideas I want to tackle in this presentation. That is the historical process of regional micropolitics as a response to moments of political and social radical transformation, and also how these experiences had a material impact, both in the constitution of the social building and also in the environment they were framed by. Going backwards from the contexts of World War II, I will specifically tackle those early medieval micropolitics in Central Iberia, which are framed between the end of the Roman Empire and the collapse of the Visigothic kingdom. In this regard, I will understand micropolitics, following Jeffrey Pfeffer in this case, as those activities taken within organization to acquire, develop, and use power and other resources to obtain one's preferred outcomes in a situation in which there is uncertainty or dissent. A perspective built on a specific image of organizations characterized by diverse goals and unclear areas of influence, paying special attention to social interaction interpreted as a strategic and conflictual struggle. So, in summary, from this perspective, two elements are crucial. So, scale and social struggle. Scale, as stated so many times by Julio Scalona, as the material and immaterial limits in which social interactions and political practices have meaning and effective consequences. Levels of social interaction that radically changed after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and social struggle as the capacity of different social agents to advance their interests in the interaction with other agents in specific scenarios or what I like to call the arenas of struggle. So based upon these premises, the general question to tackle here is when and how these early medieval micropolitics emerged, what are its main characteristics, how were power and social structure constituted within them, on what material foundations were they built upon, etc. These are some of the questions that I want to confront in this presentation, and I will be doing so by analyzing some case studies in the regions of Sierra de Ávila and Valle Amblés, located in central Iberia. Sierra de Ávila is a mountainous region of about 1,500 square kilometers, characterized by an undulating landscape with slight elevations sprinkled with granite formations called berrocales there, and mainly focused on husbandry. For its part, the Valle Amblés is a sedimentary area of around 200 square kilometers, crossed by the Ribera d'Aja, and traditionally focused on agriculture. So since 2019, we have been conducting archaeological works in these two areas within the frame of the Terra Levis Massacre project, which aim to reconnect rural communities and confront rural depopulation in these two territories. Specifically, we have conducted archaeological excavations in 4 main sites, which form the basis of my presentation. So these sites are Pared de los Moros, El Palomar, Las Enrenes and La Cova, which I will briefly describe. So Pared de los Moros is a Roman rural villa located in the middle part of this Valle Amblés, and it was excavated in the 70s and again in the early 21st century. Locating part of the villa, presumably the dwellings of the dependents, we are not sure about this, 100% sure, and a cistern, and what we are excavating right now, the part of a thermal of the part of the baths of the villa. So above the levels of abandonment, at least 4 burials were documented, probably dating in the 7th century, but we are conducting now the radiocarbon dating. Although, well, we are not sure how many. It looks like a cemetery, but we are not sure. They are only a few detected burials until now. In our excavations, we have also detected a Bronze Age context and also early Roman burials in the periphery of the Roman villa. So in summary, a complex space whose main archaeological feature is the Roman villa, but also related to a complex occupation of this space from in this case, the Bronze Age, until what we think are the medieval ages. We are not sure about this at the moment. The second site I will be talking about is El Palomar. This is an early medieval rural site located in the northern part of the Sierra de Ávila. We have documented up to a dozen dwelling structures so far, distributed in at least 2 different foci. 2 of these structures have been partially excavated, one rectangular structure with a perimeter wall, and a big multi-roomed structure with at least 5 different dependencies. These buildings have been dated between the early 7th and the 9th century AD. Las Enrenes, located in the current municipality of Chillán, is another rural site formed by 2 different nuclei, separated by a cattle road, or cañada. The first nucleus south of the cattle routes is formed by an abandoned church and some related structures which have not been yet excavated. The second nucleus in the northern part conforms the early medieval village, in which 10 or 11 domestic structures have been identified. 4 of these structures were excavated in 3 different fieldwork campaigns between 2003 and 2014, and 3 of them are rectangular buildings separated in different rooms, while the 4th is a big multi-room building composed by 7 or 8 different rooms. I will talk about this specific building later. Finally, a little cemetery of 7 burials in the cattle route were excavated, and also at the contextualized sarcophagus was documented. We have tried to get a carbon dating for these burials, but unfortunately it failed. However, its characteristics points toward an occupation between the 7th to 8th century cemetery, coherent with the initial date of the structures, which seem to last until the 9th or 10th century AD. And finally, La Cova. The site of La Cova is located in the eastern central part of the Sierra de Ávila. This site was known for some time now because of the presence of a significant number of rock burials, 87 already known, distributed in at least 5 different nuclei, in a space of 30 hectares, which coexist with a little communal cemetery of a dozen known burials, but we think this cemetery could be much, much bigger. Although some structures were recognized at the center of this space, no domestic contest had been documented before, but since 2020, we have been excavating several contexts within the site, including one rectangular building, an L-shaped building, also interpreted as a productive space, a granary, part of the communal cemetery, and part of a multi-room building in the central part of the site. Radiocarbon dating points toward an occupation of La Cova between the early 7th century and the 10th century AD, with at least 2 different moments of occupation. So once I have presented the context, I will discuss 6 different topics regarding the questions of micropolitics. So these are the space, the productive strategies, connectivity, identity, power and inequalities, and agency, focusing on peasant agency. So, the Roman military conquest of Central Iberia during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC radically transformed the prior settlement pattern aligned to the new state power. Otopidas such as La Mesa de Miranda, Cogotas, or Rulaca were depopulated during the 1st century BC, probably as a consequence of their active resistance against Roman rulers. Our recent excavations, both in La Mesa de Miranda and El Palomar, shows this radical change in both the settlement pattern and the conception of space, with the emergence of a new political economy promoted by the Roman state towards the abandonment of this prior economy towards the extensive occupation of the agrarian lands. So this is precisely what sites like Pared de los Moros represent and show. A settlement pattern focused on the extensive exploitation of the agrarian land of the sedimentary valleys, which implied the abandonment of spaces like the Sierra de Ávila. The distribution of the Roman findings in the territory clearly shows a tendency towards the extensive occupation of these sedimentary spaces to the detriment of the mountainous ones in the period between the 1st and the 5th centuries AD. Interestingly, this settlement pattern had another moment of radical change at the end of the 6th century and more probably in the early 7th century AD. It is in this moment that we detect a true explosion of settlements in previously abandoned spaces, such as, in this case, the Sierra de Ávila. This change should not be underestimated. Analyzing the distribution pattern of these settlements, dating all of them between the 7th and 10th century AD, approximately, we can see a highly populated area with little settlements every 2 to 5 kilometers in all the Sierra de Ávila. Settlements that are known through the presence of buildings or through rock burials, which are extremely common in this territory, as Iñaki, Martín Biso, and Antonio Blanco have already analyzed. These settlements are characterized by nucleated areas within which the domestic buildings are built. Concentrations of 4 to 10 domestic units are a common feature of those settlements we know the best, distributed in some cases in 2 or 3 different foci, with empty spaces in between, probably gathering, public spaces, so on. Buildings are usually rectangular and composed of 2 to 3 rooms, with some exceptions I will discuss later. Considering the examples we know from sites such as Lancha de Trigo, close to the castle of Diego Álvaro, and others in the site of El Palomar, it is likely that some of these domestic units had their own private space or even garden. What I am thinking about is that this type of buildings, like the house tree in Lancha de Trigo, these are gardens. I was considering it hearing Professor Davis' conference, but it will be interesting in the future to make some analysis in these specific spaces. But it is worth mentioning that funerary spaces play a key role in the articulation of the sites. This can be seen in both Las Enrenes and in La Cova, where the cemeteries are placed near the concentration of the domestic structures. As already said, La Cova presents two different types of funerary remains: the communal cemetery, composed of a pair of tombs made of granite slabs, and different rock burials concentrations, with a total of 87 documented so far. Radiocarbon dating and the stratigraphic sequence of La Cova points toward the idea that each of these typologies of funerary remains represent different phases of occupation of La Cova. Iñaki and me, we are still debating this point, but this is my guess, that the communal cemetery is earlier than the rock burials in this case. Anyway, what is evident is, as I will argue later, is the importance of the funerary remains, not only to articulate the space within the settlements, but also the identity of its dwellers within this micropolitics. Moreover, what it points toward is the coherence of the settlement pattern in terms of the creation of this territorial scale. So let's talk a little bit about the productive strategies of these territories. So these productive strategies are essential to characterize how micropolitics works, as it constitutes the material basis upon which power and inequality is built. Archaeological fieldwork carried out implied a targeted sampling of archaeobotanical remains that is giving us a closer look at the productive strategies of these settlements. So from a general perspective, economy in the area of Ávila is characterized, as other early medieval spaces in central Iberia, by a combined strategy towards an extensive agriculture and extensive husbandry, complemented by other activities towards the diversification of risks, mainly developed in communal areas. However, some analysis has given us a more detailed account of these strategies. So in La Cova, we were able to document a little granary made of granite slabs, which we found full of seeds. These granaries, called trojes in the territory, appear in all the structures we have excavated so far, suggesting a management of production mainly conducted by each domestic unit. The analysis of the seeds contained in this specific troje has documented a very significant amount of rye, with the occasional presence of wheat. Furthermore, this is interesting, chaff has not been documented whatsoever, which implies that the threshing will be occurring in other places, coming to this granary already cleaned. The presence of a variety of seeds in this context points toward a diversified agricultural strategy with different types of harvests managed by the same domestic unit. Moreover, palynological analysis carried out both in El Palomar and in La Cova suggest that the crop fields are located in the nearby of the households. Specifically in La Cova, palynological analysis proves the importance of the rye with a clear presence in the histogram. With all this data, it is tempting then to think of small familiar properties surrounding the inhabited spaces intensively cultivated. All in all, our hypothesis is that although it is evident that agriculture played a key role in the economies of these rural settlements, husbandry was the main economic asset in these spaces. Unfortunately, the absence of both remains due to the acidity of the soil hampers the possibility of an analysis of livestock from the bone material. However, other indicators are very suggestive. One of them is the location of the sites, preferably in those areas surrounded by grazing lands, which were object of dispute throughout the Middle Ages. Another argument is the presence of different pollen that points toward intense pastoral activity nearby the sites, such as the presence of some species of grass or fungus. A third argument is the ubiquity of materials related to husbandry, such as cowbells, in the case of Las Enrenes. Finally, a last indirect argument for the importance of husbandry in these rural sites is the presence of cattle routes in all of them, part of them crossing through the cemetery spaces. Cattle routes were evidently institutionalized in the Middle Ages after the abandonment of these spaces, but it's interesting the connection of these cattle routes with specifically the cemeteries of these spaces. So the point is that they are recovering this ancient settlement pattern, in this case, we think vindicating their importance for husbandry. The combination of anthropological and palynological analysis gives other interesting data regarding the environmental impact of these villages. So as José Antonio López Sáez and others suggested more than a decade ago, around the 7th century there was a significant increase in human pressure in the Iberian central system. This is extremely coherent with the dense settlement pattern that is detected in the Sierra de Ávila from that moment onwards. Palynological analysis shows that the landscape was similar to what we can see today, as pastures and meadows characterized by the presence of oaks and junipers as the main forest mass. The difference between the current landscape and the medieval one is evidently the density of population, practically abandoned today, and the level of development of the means of production. Also interesting is the question of the pine. Both in El Palomar and in La Cova, small quantities of pine are documented, which suggest that they were alloctonous, probably from the northern parts of the Sierra de Gredos, around 40 kilometers away. However, anthropological analysis have shown that at least some of buildings, important buildings of these sites, were built with pines. There are several ways to interpret this, but one interesting hypothesis is that domestic units could choose what would use in the buildings, probably using those with a lesser impact in the surrounding environment, managed as grazing lands and pastures. Moreover, this would imply a regular and organized exploitation of the landscape, connecting this territory with others in terms of distribution of raw material. And this brings us to another question, that of connectivity. The level of connectivity with the outer world is a crucial element to evaluate the articulation and strength of a micropolitical region. Moreover, in the case of the Sierra de Ávila and the Valle Amblés, we have the opportunity to analyze connectivity patterns from a chronological point of view, comparing the Roman and the post-Roman sites. For this matter, I have analyzed the material culture of these sites using some of the methodological tools of social network analysis, distinguishing different levels of connectivity. Thus, while Pared de los Moros still receive and consume products coming from a supra-regional scale, mostly from North African pottery productions, probably the main center of production for long-scale pottery at the time, as we know, both present several elements of transregional procedence, in this case, the Pared de los Moros, but there is no such hint, there is no such a level of connectivity in the early medieval villages in the Sierra de Ávila. The rupture with supra-regional commerce transit in central Iberia has been clearly attested for inland territories of Iberia, with a moment of big change in the mid-5th century when imports ostensibly decrease. This is also very visible in the case studies of the Valle Amblés. But this change of connectivity between the late Roman Empire and the early medieval ages has been commonly interpreted from the lenses of decadence, simplicity, and a significant decrease in the levels of complexity. While this is true and evident in terms of long-distance commerce, distribution of luxurious objects, and connectivity between remote territories, what I would argue is that understanding complexity in terms of distribution of bulk products, as Chris Wickham has suggested in his recent publication, we should not underestimate the capacity of early medieval rural villages to generate intricate networks to cope with their social and economic necessities. So this is seen in the complexity of the local, interlocal, and regional networks established by these communities. Moreover, even though long-distance commerce and trans-regional connections are clearly less dense, they are not totally absent. This is attested through different materials external to the context of production of the village, as for example the well-known liriform brooches, glass as a very good example. Although presenting in early medieval context, there are they are always documented in extremely reduced quantities, that is true, especially when compared with the late Roman contexts. But it clearly shows this connectivity and these connections in different levels of interaction. So this is what I think is interesting to analyze through these objects. So once considered the relation with the outer world of this micropolitical region, let's look at the dynamics from within. Returning to the Repubblica Partigiana of Montefiorino, one of the main elements that emerged from that political experience was the creation of a communal identity, an invention of tradition, if we prefer, that distinguished the us and them. Thus, the use of military distinctives or the spread of songs such as 5th-11th legitimized the membership of a common tradition and process. In the case of the early medieval Sierra de Ávila, I think that some strands of material culture allow us to propose a shared identity that produce a sense of belonging to a common territory. So I will tackle here two examples, that is pottery and funerary remains. Pottery is evidently one of the most common archaeological features we find in excavations. All in all, and as it was evidenced in the workshop held at Lisbon this spring, organized by Juan Antonio, Sara and Fabian, early medieval pottery is still circumscribed mainly to typological and formal analysis. And as I argued in that seed, I think that a closer look to the patterns of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption as a whole may shed some light into questions such as identity, as it has been proposed by other scholars such as Carol Kramer or James Esquivel. In the last year, we have been performing different archaeometrical analyses to pottery ensembles, mainly in the site of La Cova. Although more studies have to be performed, some hypotheses and ideas have emerged from this analysis. And one of these ideas is that although different types of production have been differentiated at the site, mainly differentiating low wheel and high wheel ones, La Cova shows that all these productions were coming from the same workshop, or at least from the same source of raw material. With slightly differences, these are the same productions located in El Palomar and Las Enrenes. At the same time, these productions seem to present identifiable differences with other contexts, such as the one in La Legoriza, another early medieval site, like 50 to 60 kilometers away. So the idea behind all this is that there is a common use of recognizable types of pottery in a common territory. Potteries that are coming probably from the same workshops. So, as an hypothesis, pottery as a sign of economic identity shared in this specific area. And funerary remains can also be seen from this point of view. La Cova is perhaps the best case study to look into. As said, this site presents two different forms of funerary rituals, a communitary cemetery of granite slabs and a number of rock burials scattered throughout this territory. Although it is still a working hypothesis, all data points towards the idea that the communitary cemetery belongs to an initial phase of occupation of La Cova, beginning in the early 7th century, and the rock burials to a second phase of occupation, dating from the mid-8th century onwards. Although it has been suggested that these cemeteries could be giving service to different communities, I think that they only belong to the dwellers of La Cova, precisely because it is one of the few sites in the Sierra de Ávila which has not other contemporary sites in the nearby. Thus, the more logical thing would be that both funerary expressions overlap in time, but evidence suggests that they are chronologically different. Following approaches such as those of Alfonso Vigil Escalera and Iñaki Martín Viso, what I may suggest is that these two funerary expressions also indicate two complementary forms of identity. One highlighting the belonging to the community in itself, another highlighting the importance of the domestic unit. What other studies points towards an increasing tension within these villages from the 8th century onwards, probably as a consequence of the pressure on the economic resources, such as the grazing lands. And funerary rituals may be working as a mechanism to mediate these tensions at a local scale. tensions and increasing differences that open me the room to talk about the powers and inequalities. So at first sight, social differences in the context of early medieval Sierra de Ávila are extremely subtle or even absent. In general terms, one could qualify this territory as an example of the peasant mode of production characterized by Chris Wickham, in which social differences are expressed within the frontiers of the village and always in constant tension with the communal identity, as a way to limit the accumulation of power in specific individuals and families, and so on and so forth. The evidence I presented suggests that the capacity of the peasantry to decide on questions such as production and consumption is very elevated, and that is our guess here. And although this is the general rule for the territory of the Sierra de Ávila, some set of evidences gives a lot of texture and complexity to this situation, being one of them the apparition of uncommon objects and materials that suggests slight social differences and inequalities in the territory. But the most interesting piece of evidence are, of course, the so-called Visigothic slates and its concentration precisely at the site in this territory, and specifically at the site of Diego Álvaro, the only place dated in these early medieval ages that can be called as such a central place. The debates and proposals around these slates are well known, and I will not explore them today, but I will only provoke with one question, one thing. So as Iñaki Martín Viso has pointed out, these slates have been found in different types of contexts, both central places and in peasant ones, and I think this is interesting to think about. This is the situation in the Sierra de Ávila, where slates have been documented in sites such as El Palomar or Las Enrenes, but also in these central places. Not, however, and this is also interesting, in sites such as La Cova, well, at least for the moment. This, I think, points toward not only the exception of the La Cova as a local central place within the micropolitical territory, but also that the geography of the slates in this territory points towards a voluntary economic strategy to include specific sites and spaces into the dynamics of this micropolitic. In other words, that the slates may be evidencing economic strategies of these macroterritorial powers as a technology of power used to give coherence to the inner dynamics. Finally, I arrive to the discussion of agency, and as Juan Antonio Quiroz has recently argued, peasant agency is one of the most stimulating topics coming from the so-called archaeological turn of the early medieval ages. Peasant agency that, as Susan Kilby has stated, should be analyzed contextually, as well as power and social inequalities. This contextuality is precisely what I think addresses the analysis of this kind of micropolitics. As well as power relationships and social inequalities, peasant agency can be visibilized through different pieces of evidence. ¿Me queda tiempo, no? Ah, que te veo ahí. Vale, perdona. Here I will suggest two ideas. So the first one is the use of domestic architecture as a means of expression of peasant agency. Following Amos Rappaport's analysis of vernacular architecture, what we can state is that analyzing the domestic architecture of the territory of the Sierra de Ávila, there is a common and coherent model or paradigm of building the house, with stone foundations and thick stone walls, drawing rectangular buildings with 2 to 4 rooms as the common feature, the common construction. However, within this model, there are many specificities that allow us to talk about the choosing capacity of these societies. The most striking fact is, for example, the total absence of tiles at the site of La Cova, extremely common in sites such as Las Enrenes or El Palomar, where we have found more than 500 kilograms of tiles. So the question is, why did the community of La Cova not use tiles, while contemporary settlements in the surroundings are using them in elevated quantities? This is a complex question, but a very suggestive and simple solution is that people of La Cova did not want to use tiles. They choose not to. That they have the possibility, but they didn't. That thatched buildings, in this case, were part of their identity and their capacity to manage the landscape. And the other piece of evidence I want to discuss here also relates to the domestic architecture. One thing that seems to be a common feature in all these villages is the presence of a special multi-roomed building, mainly in the central parts of the settlement. This is the case of El Palomar, La Cova, Las Enrenes, and also in other settlements such as La Legoriza. These buildings are also characterized by the presence of uncommon materialities in comparison with the common houses. Thus, for example, in El Palomar, we have found several huts, iron axes, the pieces of glass we have found so far in the territory are here. In Las Enrenes, the presence of an ensemble of iron tools, a pile made of sandstone, specifically la conocida piedra de Villamayor, that is a specific sandstone that is 100 kilometers away of Las Enrenes. Or a possible aspergillum or ritual bronze tool in the case of Las Enrenes. And in La Cova, in these buildings, in a little survey we have made in this multi-room building, we have found a significant amount of pottery, including a high well pitch, which is very uncommon to find in domestic contexts, and a lot of iron tools. So the interpretation of these buildings is difficult, but I would suggest as an hypothesis that they respond to communal buildings in which different productive and ritual functions are performed. Moreover, it is tempting and provoking to relate them to those conventus publicus vicinorum mentioned in some documentary sources between the 6th and the 8th centuries. In any case, the presence of these buildings gives a lot of complexity in the articulation of agency in peasants' contexts in early medieval central Iberia. So to conclude, I will make some general points, being the first that in early medieval ages there was an increasing importance of micropolitics, and I think this is a very interesting path to follow in the future, mainly in those territories such as central Iberia, in the peripheries of the emerging states, and emerging as a consequence of the collapse of prior states, in this case the Roman states. One key element of analysis is the capacity of different agents involved in these micropolitics to advance their interests in different arenas of struggle and by different material means. In the case of the Sierra de Ávila, a major development in the settlement pattern can be traced back to the early 7th century, when a really significant explosion of settlements covered this territory. Social groups behind this historical process are not clear, but my guess and the most suggestive idea is to see the combination of local elites expanding their influence into new territories, altogether with peasant-based societies with a higher level to impose and choose the productive strategies. This micropolitics was built on an economical base, basis on the combination of intensive agriculture and extensive husbandry. However, the main element for social differentiation within this territory was this husbandry, and especially the control over grazing lands and pastures, which became critical during the early medieval ages. And finally, these tensions in the territory develop, I think, new forms of central places, but also new coherent identities which used materiality and the ecological record we can study today as a main element to give coherence and materialize this identity. So thank you very much.